All right, and welcome back. So today we're getting pretty deep into the 19th century. I've mentioned it before, but the way we teach 19th century art or art history is really kind of wrong. It doesn't make much sense. The 19th century is a century dominated by the French Academy, by the Royal Academies, by this academic naturalistic style, and it just doesn't disappear. And yet, if you look at your art history textbook, your average art history textbook, you crack it open to the middle of the 19th century, suddenly we're talking about Realism, Impressionism, and then Post-Impressionism, and then boom, we're off to the races in Modernism here. So you get this impression that the Academy was only limping along in the second half of the 19th century, and that suddenly modernism just was triumphant and resurgent and was everywhere. And that's really not accurate at all. The Academy had a good long life in it. It didn't die at the Salon des Refusés in 1863. It wouldn't die for another 40, 50 years. But of course, we live in the future. And because we live in the future, we know what happened. And this is a fault of history. This is a major methodological fallacy that you often see in history. We are here in the future, so we look to the past to figure out how did we get here. And so we oftentimes ignore the things that don't lead to where we're standing right now. Since modernism became dominant in the 20th century, we look at the 19th century and we say, okay, what were the clues that modernism was going to be this dominant force in the early 20th and 20th century? We look back to the 19th century. So we actually don't teach 19th century art. Pretty much by the time we get halfway through the 19th century, we stop teaching 19th century art and we start teaching pre-modernism, the things that led to the modern revolution in the 20th century. Of course, we have the advent of hindsight. We live in the future relative to the people in the 19th century, so we can look back and say, oh, wow, well, that was a major force to be reckoned with, and that's what happened. But people in the 19th century wouldn't have seen it that way. This idea that modernism, what we call modernism, with its move towards surface, its move towards abstraction, and to removal from the classical and naturalistic tradition, those seem obvious to us in retrospect, but it would not have seemed obvious in retrospect or obvious at the time to people living in the 19th century. The common analogy that I give for this is, imagine you go back to the 2nd century. It's the height of the Roman Empire. Rome is the greatest power in Europe and the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is a Roman lake. And you show up, time traveler who knows the future, and you say to that Roman, hey, in a couple centuries, this is all going to convert to Christianity. And then about a century after that, all of your Roman religion is going to basically be declared verboten, illegal, and the whole world's going to become Christian, and Christianity is going to become the dominant force that moves forward for the next 1,000 years. And he would have looked around at you, and he would have looked around at these Christians who, quite frankly, weren't up to much in the 2nd century and said, seriously, these guys? He never would have believed it. We know the rest of the story. To quote Paul Harvey, famous newscaster and radio personality, we know the rest of the story. So we know that, yeah, those Christians didn't seem like they were up to much in the 2nd century, but turned out they were the smarter bet, and they ended up dominating the entire Middle Ages in 1,000 years of history in not very long. And so it's the same thing when we talk about modernism in 20th century art and contemporary art. We know who the winners were, but if you were in the 19th century, you wouldn't have known who the winners were. So it's really kind of problematic in a way, because we actually have a false impression of what the 19th century was really like. And if you really want to get a good understanding of what the 19th century was like, I strongly recommend Courtney Davis's class. Courtney Davis teaches 19th century art history at UVU, my institution. She does a phenomenal job, and she gives a much more nuanced and balanced look at what the 19th century was really like. But this is a survey class. The whole point of a survey class is to give you a sense of where the horizon is and how did we get there. I'm here for the grand narrative. We in art history love grand narratives. And so we kind of teach modernism as if it was inevitable, like it was this grand arching narrative. Mankind, his reach exceeding his grasp, all this kind of highfalutin humanistic ideals. And so we teach the 19th century as if it was a foregone conclusion that modernism was going to come out of it. It is what it is. There's no other way to get around it. But I do like to, I know that's an enormous amount of throat clearing for an introduction to the lecture, but I really have to get through it because it really is a kind of jaded view. But it's the way we teach it. And ultimately from 19th century, from about this time on, we're really going to be telling you the story, how did we get to the 20th century? And not really giving you much on the Academy. I'm really excited because when I was an art student, yes, I started as an art student, hated being an art student, hated the burden of creativity, couldn't stand it. But there were hardly any teachers who were teaching classical academic naturalistic art. None of them were. In fact, there were several that were competent that could have taught it, but they just weren't interested. So nobody wanted to teach it to you. And I got bored. And I moved first to illustration, and then I eventually discovered art history. I mean, it was this whole profession where I didn't have to create. I could just talk about other people's creativity, which I always thought was far more interesting than anything I could do. So I moved into art history. But that's changed. Now, if you go into an art school, there's lots of people teaching naturalistic art. So there's been a huge resurgence in academic naturalistic art, the kind of art that existed in the 19th century. And more importantly, there's been a total reappraisal of those artists. If you were to go back to the 19th century, and in fact this actually happened, in the year 1897, I think it was Le Monde, the newspaper, that may be wrong, don't quote me on that, but did a survey, and it did a survey saying, who is going to be the artist that's going to be remembered 100 years from now? And the three artists that came to the top were Gérôme, Massenet, and Bouguereau. And you could be forgiven for not knowing who any of those people are today. But in 1897, they were regarded as the greatest French artists, and that they would be the ones who'd be remembered 100 years from now. 100 years from then, hardly anybody remembered. Instead, they remembered people like Van Gogh and Manet and Monet and Degas, etc. But those guys weren't even competitive. In 1897, they weren't even considered competitive. And so the whole world changed. The whole world thought that the art world was centered around this academic naturalistic style, and it changed dramatically. But I'm starting to see that you're starting to see people get more interested into this 19th century art, into the Massenet, the Bouguereau, the Gérôme. I think that people just wanted to know what was going on. In many ways, that era kind of perfected art, that they had so perfected academic naturalism, there was no other way to go but abstraction. Some of that explains modernism. But there's been a resurgence and interest in these kind of lost masters of the 19th century, and lots of people are writing monographs and books and texts on them so that you can kind of catch up on them. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, sorry, we're not going to talk about it. But I can refer you to some sources if you're interested in kind of late 19th century academic style. What we're going to do instead is we're going to talk about how does modernism get started. Okay, my gosh, I blathered on for nearly 9 minutes. Let's keep going. Okay, so when we start with where does modernism come from, you can really start to see the fracture in Romanticism. Romanticism is this movement of the early 19th century. There are no hard dates on Romanticism. We're clearly into Romanticism by the time we hit 1810s, 1820s, but by the 1840s it seems to have already waned in its significance and its importance, but it will continue to have reverberations going on. So Romanticism, it's important to know, was a broad intellectual movement. It wasn't just Romanticism in art, it was Romanticism in poetry, Romanticism in music. This is the era of Chopin. This is also the era of the great English Romantic poets, people like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Wordsworth, etc. And this is, again, another swing of the pendulum. Remember, we've talked about the pendulum in this class, that you have a pendulum swings toward hard-edge classicism, and then it kind of swings back. And people are like, I don't know, it's just too stale, and we're going to go Mannerist. And then we swing back, and we go a little bit more Baroque, and then we swing to Rococo. Rococo was such a hard swing that we moved to Neoclassicism, but Neoclassicism was seen as kind of soulless, dispassionate. And so we move away from the age of reason to the age of passion, and that's what we mean by the Romantic age. People wanted to experience a more full life. And so it's not romantic in the sense of erotic love, although there was plenty of that going on, and all of the famous Romantic poets were notorious womanizers and slept around a ton. But it was romantic in all aspects of life, that you were going to live the most full and adventurous life, that these were the things that were motivating people. So you see Beethoven. Beethoven starts as a classical composer, but by the time he gets to the end, he's breaking the rules. He's putting in full choirs into his symphonies. He's breaking those structures. So if neoclassicism was all about structure and rules, Romanticism is about breaking the rules and finding that kind of passion. And so how do they break the rules? Well, they break away from the rules in many ways. One of the most obvious is that they start going to contemporary subject matter. The neoclassical age was about elevating the classical subject matter, so the myths. So if you think back to Jacques-Louis David's Death of Socrates, or any of those kind of things, even when he did a contemporary subject like the Death of Marat, he would elevate that almost as if it were a classical subject matter. You treated contemporary subjects as if they were classical, and you elevated classical subjects to the height. But you're going to see in Romanticism a willingness to go to contemporary subject matter, to bring much more contemporary subject matter to the fore and to the foreground. And you're also going to see the elevation of things that were often considered low, like everyday scenes of life, like genre, are going to become elevated in the Romantic period. And also landscape. Landscape's going to be elevated. And also current events, politics, are going to become much more important. And you're going to see a kind of activist strain develop amongst the Romantic artists. They're actually going to pull from contemporary events and use those to highlight current social responsibilities or even kind of political problems. It's really amazing. One of the things about landscape is that landscape is going to be elevated. It makes sense that this is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And with the Industrial Revolution, you're going to see people look around the landscape. They're going to see the landscape being dominated by factories and mills and their rivers polluted and smokestacks everywhere. And they're going to wonder what they've lost. And so this is where people really get into this love of the land and love of nature. And so naturally, that's going to elevate things like landscape. And landscape is going to be a way to express this idea that, wait a minute, there are things bigger and beyond us. If the neoclassical period gave us the ordered universe where it was a Newtonian clockwork universe where we could figure it out and we could use science and reason to make it work. The Romantic movement is going to say, hey, wait a minute, there's some things that are beyond us, and who wants to have a world that you control anyway? A world that you're entirely controlled of loses its mystery, loses its wonder, and we don't want that. So landscape is going to be elevated. And landscape, the interesting thing about landscape is clouds, sea, foam, trees, they're all kind of vaguely abstract. They don't really follow, regimented composition. They are kind of irregular organic shapes. And you can see that like in this detail of Turner's, that it simply becomes color and light. And so you're starting to see the beginnings of the seeds of abstraction, which will be a major feature of modernism, come in as well. There's also going to be more concentration on surface, more concentration on what I like to call the painter's mark. I almost said the maker's mark, and that that would make me sound like I'm a closet alky, but I'm not. Anyhow, I meant to mean the painter's mark. What I mean is his mark on the canvas, how he interacts. A lot of the neoclassical stuff was about eliminating the maker's mark to make it look as smooth and as realistic as possible in tiny little glazes and infinitesimally small brushstrokes. But the Romantics are going to be like, no, I'm going to let that brushstroke stand. I'm going to let it be visible, and it's going to give another level of expression to the work that adds to this rich nature of the painting. So Romanticism is very different, but it's still going to borrow a lot on things that came from the Academy. And it's the Rubenists. Remember, we have the French Academy, we have two camps, the people who are following the Poussinists and the people who are following the Rubenists. The Rubenists follow after Rubens. Rubens is going to emphasize color, motion, emotion, expressive brushwork, those kind of things. So the Romanticists are definitely coming out of the Rubenist camp. Okay, let's get started then. One of our earliest Romantic painters is going to be Goya. Francisco Goya is a Spanish painter, and he is active in Spain, and he becomes the court painter. He's also known as a lithographer and a printer. So a person of quite high and significant status. But right away, you're going to see something a little different. Remember, you're a court painter, you have a patron. Your job is to make your patron look good. And here he is painting the family of Charles IV. And yet right away, you should recognize something is a little bit off here. First off, you've got to see the references to Las Meninas, the Maids of Honor from Velázquez. Remember, Goya is Spanish, so it makes sense that he would be very familiar with Velázquez's work. And so much like Velázquez has this very painterly style, loose brushwork, that kind of thing, you can see that same thing at work here. For example, when you look at the details on the dresses, also in the hair, you have this light, painterly, brush-like quality where the brushwork is allowed to be visible. You also have the kind of subject matter of the easel and then the artist hiding back there, so it's clear reference to what's going on. But when we look at the royal family, I don't know, it's kind of strange. Some people are off gazing into the background, they're not paying attention. Other people are minimized. Other people are giving you kind of scary looks from the background. The queen doesn't look especially graceful or elegant. They all look kind of pudgy, heavy, and a little bit rosy-cheeked. In fact, people talked about the monarch that he didn't look like a monarch. He looked like he was a butcher in a common market. And so this came under harsh criticism. To this day, we're still not entirely certain of what's going on here. Is Goya trying to humanize them, or is he trying to caricature them? And you can make a case either way. But the ruddiness of the king's complexion, the lack of definition in the faces and in the figures, maybe this is just an extension of his brushwork, or maybe it's that he really doesn't give a darn, and he almost seems more interested in their clothing than he does in their faces. We see a bit more of Goya's intent when we get to this wonderful object, which is called the 3rd of May, 1808. So this was the Napoleonic era. This also was the era when France started the Iberian War. Spain was a relatively minor player in the Iberian War, ironically enough. It was the location for the battle, but it was largely a battle between the major continental powers, England on one side and France on the other. And all manners of atrocities happened, and this was a particularly noted atrocity committed by French soldiers. So what we see in this scene is this atrocity. We see the dead bodies, the shooting squad, the firing squad, executing people, people hiding their face in fear and in shame, people dreading their upcoming execution. The soldiers here are dark and foreboding and faceless. We have a realm of shadow. We have the person with his arms outstretched, ready to receive either a bayonet or a bullet, either one. The scene then is intensely political. It draws on a recent event. This was painted in 1814, but commemorates an event that happened in 1808. So this was still within living memory of people, of the kind of atrocities that were perpetrated upon the Spanish people. And it highlights this. Now, the grotesque, the violent, these are also aspects of the Romantic period. The Romantic period is not all fluffy and light like the Rococo. They were willing to go to dark places and dark emotions. Here, this one's remarkable because it takes a current event and elevates it, gives it kind of a heroic scope. But he was willing to do that in other places as well. One of my favorite series of paintings is a series of paintings he painted on the walls of his studio. We're not entirely certain who he painted these for, maybe his own enjoyment. They later became some of the most famous paintings he painted, although it's doubtful they were ever intended for a public audience. They took existing classical motifs and recast them in terrifying and phantasmagorical ways. The story of Saturn devouring his children is a famous story out of classical mythology. Saturn is as a Titan, he's the king of the Titans. This is the first generation of gods in Greek mythology. But it's prophesied that one of his own children will overthrow him, so he swallows his own children whole, and then eventually he is tricked, and he swallows a stone instead of swallowing his son Zeus. And then Zeus actually is raised secretly on the island Crete. He grows, and then he actually slays his own father, and in the process saves his brothers and sisters, who are all still inside of him, and they come out. And that's Hades and Poseidon and Hera, and I think a number of others. And so it's kind of an interesting story of overcoming your father. Saturn, of course, is also known as Kronos, that's time. So Zeus is actually conquering time. It's this primordial myth in Greek mythology. But nothing here actually references that except the basic elements of the story. But instead of swallowing his children whole, he is ripping them apart. Saturn, instead of being an idealized kind of Titan, is this kind of crazy-eyed old man representing time. And so he isn't a god in a mythological narrative anymore. He's kind of an allegorical figure. Perhaps he represents the slow march of time which destroys all of us. It's kind of hard to imagine this child ever being vomited back up whole, as it is in the actual myth. So it takes ideas that are there, but gives radical interpretations on them. And then stylistically, the brushwork is very visible. You have this suffused darkness. He was also a noted lithographer and made a whole series of prints. This is perhaps one of the most famous series of prints that he made. This one is The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters. So here is, and depicted as an artist, notice his brush there. The artist, which is probably a kind of representation of the artist Goya himself, sleeps, and then owls and bats and other creatures of the nights, a lynx, come and plague him and torment him. This was part of a whole series of kind of satirical prints that were very, very popular. So Goya is one of the first artists that, by a series of steps, breaks down stylistically the way you were supposed to paint using more loose brushwork, but also thematically tackles these things and also brings contemporary subject matter to the fore. Another artist that does that, who dies far too young, is Géricault. Géricault was a French Romantic painter, and he dies very young age, but he was noted for a kind of uncompromising realism. He would go into insane asylums and paint sensitive portraits of the individuals he would find there. These are, again, very analogous to the paintings of Velázquez, where he painted studies of the people of the court, but painted them as real subject matter, bringing them to the fore. You can see the sensitivity. Even though we're looking at a madman and a madwoman, there's evidence of their kind of disheveled appearance, of their insanity, but otherwise they're treated pretty straightforwardly. But we do have loose brushstrokes. You can see the brushstrokes vivid, and a commitment to the intensity of the figures. There's no sense of kind of glossing over the realities. Again, Romanticism is willing to look at some pretty dark emotions, which probably attracted him to his most famous subject matter. That's the Raft of the Medusa. This one is also unique in the sense that it commemorates a scandalous event that happened at the same time. So by this time, we're into the restoration of the monarchy in France. France goes through a number of political changes in the early 19th century. And at this point, there was this horribly scandalous event where the Medusa was a ship that was sent to West Africa to reestablish French colonies in West Africa that they had kind of lost track of because of the various Napoleonic wars. The ship was sent there, and it was actually captained by a person who was close confidant and relative to the king. And the ship ran aground on a shoal. and in the process of running around in the shoal became unsaleable. And there were only longboats for only so many people. So what they did is they loaded the captain and his officers on this expedition into the longboats, and then they took the rest of the crew and constructed a raft. And the raft would be towed by the longboats so that they could bring everyone. At some point, the raft began to bog down, and so the decision was made to cut the raft loose. And so these were people who were there, for the French government to expand the French colonial project, and they were utterly abandoned and left to die. So this caused an enormous scandal in the press and in the newspapers. Now, it became a political scandal because of the head of the expedition and his association with the French king, and the fact that this had French royal support. How could you do this to these people? So it's kind of an odd subject matter. Usually, when you give great heroic weight, you elevate something to epic status, it's going to be some classical myth or story of victory in battle. But these were ordinary men. I love how everything mounts up like a pyramid in the composition. These two figures here have pulled off their shirts, and if you can see, are trying to gain the attention of this ship here on the horizon. But all is lost. You can see the dead and the dying. Some of their bodies are already in the surf. Some of them are already, decaying and falling apart. The people who were on this raft, just suffered horrible deprivations. So this painting brought this national scandal to even greater prominence. And again, a contemporary subject matter, not something that you would normally see elevated to this level. Géricault's commitment to getting the details right, to getting the horror of death and starvation and death at sea right, required him to actually go to morgues. And he was rather kind of noted for his morbid fascination with bodies. So he would actually go to morgues and see dead bodies, and he would do studies of limbs. So you have these severed limbs that he would use, and he would use these to get the details in this painting right. So again, that's another romantic notion. You're going to make sure you get your corpses and everything else right. So you go and you do studies from actual models and actual dead people in morgues. It's pretty fascinating. So this all shows how Romanticism was breaking with the past. This isn't some classical myth from centuries past. This is a contemporary event. Now, as we look at these figures, they are treated somewhat classically. They are given a kind of heroic scope. The bodies are displayed almost like figures on a classical battlefield. But this contemporary nature of it is really what makes it so powerful, I think. This brings us to probably the most prominent Romantic painter, the most preeminent French Romanticist and history painter of the era, Eugène Delacroix. Delacroix was admitted to the Academy and actually had standing in the Academy. The Romantic painters were not rebels or outsiders in the same way that the Realists and the Impressionists were. We'll talk about them later. They did have some kind of acceptable understanding and standing in the Academy, and actually trained in the Academy and trained others within the Academy. But his reputation was not as high as, say, Ingres. Ingres was the most preeminent neoclassical painter of the time. And it's important to remember that he and Ingres were contemporaries, that they were living at the same time. They were, in many ways, competitors. Delacroix gains attention through these large-scale, massive paintings. This one is the Massacre at Chios. So the Ottoman Empire was in its death throes in the 19th century, and because there was this rising fascination with the West, with the origins of the West, which the West identified as Greece, you start to see independence movements flare up. The Ottoman Empire was failing, and so various different groups of people, Greeks, Armenians, Arabs, etc., began to agitate for their independence against the Ottoman Empire. And the Greeks were a major feature of that. You even have Lord Byron going and fighting on behalf of the Greeks and their independence movement, really kind of amazing. This, of course, leads them into direct conflict with the Ottoman Empire, and there was this terrible massacre at Chios where Greeks were slaughtered by the Ottomans. So this is meant to show the immediate aftermath and the horrors of war. But again, a contemporary subject matter, not something that happened in the remote past, not some ancient Greek battle at the time of the 5th century BC, but a battle happening right now. But clearly an attempt to equate the struggles of contemporary Greek peoples with the ancient Greek peoples who were seen as these founders of Western civilization. So what we have is a very terrible and sordid scene. Again, looming in the background are our Ottoman janissaries. You have this Ottoman captain who is drawing his sword, ready to cut down this individual as he drags one woman away behind his horse. We have an old woman, we have a dead mother, and even though the mother is dead, the child is still trying to nurse at the mother's breast. We have deceased warriors, and it's not an accident that they're stripped naked and look just like ancient Greek statues because they're meant to have this kind of weight. Everything here is about the death and the loss, because this was a loss on the part of the Greeks, and the evilness of the Turks in this case in slaughtering them. So a political story, but a story that ties into the classical roots, but again, rooted in the modern day. Perhaps one of the most famous paintings that does this is this Liberty Leading the People. This was in commemoration of the Revolution of 1830. Here, Delacroix is commemorating the Revolution of 1830. Again, not going to get into the details. Early French 19th century history is really complex. You have the Revolution, then you have the First Empire under Napoleon, then you have the Restoration of the monarchy, then you have another revolution, then you have another monarchy come in with Louis Philippe, and then Louis Philippe is taken down, and then you have the heirs to Napoleon come in the Second Empire. It's all very convoluted. It's a mess. And now you understand more about Les Miserables than you ever did. And so we see this scene. So in the scene, we have La Marianne. Now, La Marianne she is to France what Uncle Sam is to the United States. She is the personification of France. And she is leading the people over the barricades in this victory, in this moment for France. She is a classical figure. She has a Phrygian cap. The Phrygian cap is a classical cap that comes from classical history, but it's also a cap that was used during the French Revolution to indicate the revolution. This kind of Jacobean cap that's usually red. She holds aloft the tricolor, the emblem of the French Republic and the French Revolution. And she is bare-breasted, again, to show that she is open to all of the assaults against her, but also to indicate that she is kind of a goddess. She is not, she is a personification of the people. She is not actually a physical person. But notice, she's not holding a sword. She's holding a musket with a bayonet. So she is armed in a contemporary way. And other than her and her immediate dress, everything around her is contemporary. We have dead soldiers here at the battlement. We have people brandishing pistols, and this individual carries a blunderbuss. The figures who are marching forward are from all walks of life. Some of them have no shoes. Some of them are a little bit more bourgeoisie and middle class. This was to show that this is a revolution of all the people against the corrupt system. But there's also a fair measure of the horrors of war. We see bodies that have been stripped of their clothing, bodies that have been rifled over. If you look at this figure, they're carrying an ammo pouch, and the ammo pouch actually has the royal emblem on it, indicating that the figures of the revolution had to literally rob the bodies of the people they were revolting against for the basic necessities of the revolution itself. that it shows their ingenuity, but also shows their desperation and their poverty in how they had to fight against this system. So it creates a very powerful message that, in a way, is kind of strangely disjointed. You have at the heart of it this very classical scene, but then you have all of this robust contemporary imagery. You also have much ruddier use of colors, more dramatic use of brushwork. This is something that Delacroix was known for, his very loose and fluid use of brushwork. Here's an oil sketch that he did of his friend and companion, Frédéric Chopin. Chopin being the famous Romantic French composer. So a lot of these composers and writers and intellectuals corresponded with each other and associated with each other, feeding off each other's ideas. As music in the Romantic period was relieved of the structure of classicism and was allowed to be more expressive, so too paint was allowed to be more expressive. And so you see this wonderful, rich brushwork that's presented here. This is something that you can see likewise in this wonderful scene, which is, again, an odalisque. So I spoke about odalisques before. Odalisques are basically erotic, orientalized females. When we say Orient, that means anything from the Near East to the Far East, but generally it means the Near East, so it means women from Turkish harems. And again, the Western fascination with erotic themes, the genius of Western art to turn anything into porn is pretty remarkable. So there we are. And of course the neoclassical painters, Ingres and everybody else did it. So, you know, he wasn't above doing it too. So we have this figure laying back on a divan. We have the hookah, all the usual kind of oriental gewgaws and gimracks that indicate that this is a Turkish harem. And of course, a lavish naked female displayed across it. Now, I do want to state, this is a little bit excessive. I do want to state that it's interesting because Delacroix was one of the few painters of the time who, when he painted oriental scenes, that is, scenes that are meant to represent Islamic settings of the Mediterranean, that he actually could be reasonably sensitive. He took trips to Morocco and made many kind of sketchbooks of his experience and took those and used those as the basis for making studio works. So when he does, say, The Women of Algiers, it gives a much different environment. The dress here is more authentic, the interior furnishings are more authentic, and a lot more respectable. But so he could be a lot more authentic due to this experience. A lot of these artists who were doing these Orientalist themes never ever left France. They were just doing these things because they loved them and because they were powerful and erotic, and they did them to suit the tastes of their clients. But Delacroix actually traveled to North Africa and could actually paint from experience. But that's not going to stop him from doing something that's essentially a piece of cheesecake and soft porn every once in a while. But laying that aside, what I want to concentrate about this painting is the brushwork. How incredibly soft it is. How incredibly vivid and powerful it is. You can practically count the brushstrokes in this painting. You know exactly how he's making and constructing forms, and none of it is labored. Now, he himself may have thought of this only as a study, so this maybe is even a little bit looser than we might have expected of a finished work. But I just want to compare it for a moment in the same subject matter to one by Ingres. And this was, you know, the Grand Odalisque by Ingres, and you can see how remarkably different it is. Now, a couple of things here. The Delacroix is probably a study. It's probably not regarded as a finished painting, and it's also a lot smaller. So there is an issue of scale to compare here. But even when you look at details of Ingres' work, you can't see the brushwork. It's a completely different understanding. And these paintings are more or less contemporaneous, and Delacroix and Ingres are contemporaries. They knew each other. They knew each other in the academy. And so here you have the same subject matter, two completely radically different styles. The most obvious thing is the brushwork. The brushwork is so loose, so fluid, so visible. It becomes its own entity. There's this emphasis on the surface. The surface really comes alive. Whereas the surface is pretty much invisible in this painting. It's so glossy smooth you can't even get a sense of it. The figure is also, when we talk about composition, this one is laying back. The composition is much more dramatic. This one turns her shoulder back to us, seems much more reserved. And that shows the tension that existed between the Romantic era and the Neoclassical era. It's why the Romantics are seen as the forebearers to Realism and Impressionism, while Neoclassicism is not. Neoclassicism is tightly associated with the Academy and with official styles, and Romanticism is seen as the kind of edgy hipsters, the revolutionaries who are, fighting against the system, as it were. And this is even recognized at the time. This is a cartoon from the time period that has a caricature of Delacroix and Ingres fighting each other. And what I love is that they are both on horses and they're jousting with each other, but they're jousting with brushes. And so Delacroix is over here, he represents the Romantic camp, and Ingres is over here and he represents the Neoclassical camp. Now, for years, I thought they actually hated each other. I had kind of been told that they were rivals, but a reassessment of that by a bunch of recent scholars whose name escapes me right at the moment. That's terrible, Trav. Bad art historian. You should always show your sources. You should always show your work. But a reappraisal recently has discovered that there really wasn't any evidence that they were at enmity with each other. They were both at the Academy together. All evidences that they got along. That they didn't see themselves as rivals. That they didn't hate each other and have this intense rivalry. But it's clear that the press at the time thought of them as rivals. It's clear that the world saw that something was changing. So while they themselves were not at enmity with each other and were not technically rivals who hated each other and were trying to champion the one true way, they had a fairly collegial relationship at the Academy. It was clear that everyone else saw that there was tension here in this system, that the Romantics really were challenging in some way the authority of the Academy and the style of the Academy. And this is also recognized elsewhere. One of the things that's really interesting about Delacroix is he had a very long career, and again, he was a member of the Academy and very well accepted at the Academy. One of the traditions of the Academy is that when you are a member of the Academy, you will have your portrait painted by another member of the Academy, usually a more senior member, and that's a way of commemorating your presence, your kind of inclusion into it. For whatever reason, and we're not entirely certain why, Delacroix never got a formal portrait at the Academy. Years later, other artists, especially artists who saw Delacroix as this great artist that heralded the advancement into what would become Realism and Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, saw this as a great slight on his character and his reputation. So Henri Fontaine-Latour, who is here he is, here's his artist palette and his wonderful poet's blouse and his wild hair. This artist here decided that he would paint a portrait of Delacroix. So Delacroix is painted in the background, and he paints him surrounded with all of the individuals that saw him as hero or a champion of the realist movement. And so right at the very front you have James Abbott McNeill Whistler, the American painter who was active in France and London and painted Whistler's mother. We'll get to that eventually. But we also have Edward Manet, who is seen as one of the first great realist painters and also as an impressionist. But we also have great intellectuals and art critics like Charles Baudelaire, who's here as well, and a number of others that we won't get into because of time restraints. So clearly here in the 1860s, you have artists who are saying, yeah, this was the moment when. And I think that's the more important thing, that even if Delacroix himself did not recognize that he was a break with the past and this stepping stone into modernism, the people who followed in his immediate footsteps, people like Whistler, Latour, and Manet recognized that he was this painter, and they, by creating this and posing for this scene, wanted to be placed in his presence as his intellectual children, his artistic children, that they were the ones who were going to carry on his legacy. So Romanticism really did, by its technique, its greater emphasis on surface, its emphasis on contemporary themes, its emphasis on more dramatic, kind of passionate portrayal, really did mark a kind of break and set the groundwork for modernism. We're not modernism yet. There's endless debates over which movement in the 19th century is the first truly modern movement. Some would put it at realism, some would put it at impressionism. I think everybody agrees that by the time we get to post-impressionism, we're there. But somewhere in those magic years between 1850 and 1880, we cross over from the past into modernism, with its emphasis more on expression, the surface, the painter's mark, abstraction, symbolism, those kind of things. And you'll see that happening. But nobody thinks that possibly could have happened without the Romantic painters. The Romantic painters are, the intellectual forebears to the modernists. Which brings us into landscape. Oh my gosh. So the thing, it's funny because, okay, I'm going to say something negative about, geez. It was just her birthday too, and I'm doing this to her. Okay, Mom, if you hear this, I apologize. But if you ask people like my mother, here I am, I'm throwing my mother under the art history bus. There you go. Beep, beep. We're right over the top of you. Speed bump. Oh, I am the worst son ever. But if you were to ask people of my mother's generation what art was, she doesn't deserve this. But if you were to ask people of my mother's generation what art was, it's amazing how instantly landscape would come to the front of your imagination. I mean, people just think about it. If you think about, okay, so what is art about? And landscape is just something we accept, landscape painting, landscape painters, taking a look at landscape, we just assume that's one of the major themes of art. And if you look at people's houses, you look at the kind of art that they hang up to decorate their house, the things they like. If you look at their wallpapers on their desktops, on their computers, it's going to be scenes of nature. It's going to be landscape. And that's just the thing that people just accept. It's really amazing to think that that's not the way people would have thought even just 200 years ago. Landscape was seen as a minor feature of art. This idea of, today when you imagine the artist, the stereotype of an artist, he's some guy who carries an easel out into nature and paints, fields, etc., and en plein air, out in the fresh open air. That's just our stereotype of an artist. We have that so ingrained into us. But that wasn't the case. That wasn't the case even 200 years ago. Landscape was something you did to fill in the backgrounds of your more important paintings, or it's something you did to gain practice for those more important paintings. Sure, there was Claude Lorrain and a few others who were painting landscapes, but those landscapes were always contextualized to have a greater meaning. But this full embrace of landscape for the sake of landscape, that landscape was one of the most important subjects you could paint, and that it becomes elevated to where nobody even second guesses it now. Nobody goes at a landscape painter and saying, oh, you're painting landscapes. Yeah, maybe there's some high-end conceptual snobs and some of the blue chip galleries that are only into high-end conceptual art. Maybe they're looking down on landscape, but nobody does. And that happened during the Romantic period. And it makes sense because it's the Romantic period that we first start to get a sense of, naturalism, and by naturalism I mean a love of nature. Not, oh gosh, art history is so confusing. We use terms so many different ways. So naturalism, a naturalist is somebody who studies nature. This was, of course, the era of the great naturalists. This is when Charles Darwin went out on, is it the Beagle? The HMS Beagle? I went to the Galapagos Islands. Oh, some science YouTuber is going to correct me on that. But he goes out and or is it the Basset? fudge, I can't remember. But he goes out to the Galapagos Islands. He records nature. This was the era of the great naturalists. This was the era when people started going into nature and really trying to understand it. And this elevates the profile of nature. But the other thing that elevates it is the Industrial Revolution. That we see the landscape changing dramatically. That it was almost entirely an agrarian society at the beginning of the 19th century. At the beginning of the 19th century, you know, chances are you would have been a farmer. You always have these, you know, stories of people imagining what their past lives were. And it always amazes me that people imagine their past lives, and they always imagine that they were wealthy and famous people. I was Cleopatra. I hate to break it to you, but chances are, you know, 1 out of 100,000, you would have been a farmer. You would have been a peasant. And why? Because most of us were peasants. Most of us were farmers. At the beginning of the 19th century, the vast majority of people, well over 90% of the population, were engaged in some way in farming. And it took so much effort just to farm. By the end of the 19th century, those numbers are almost completely reversed until it's shocking how what a small part of our population today actually goes to feed us. The vast majority of us do something else. That's a huge change. We went from an agrarian culture to an urban culture in a century. And so you have these huge population booms because of increases in productivity and increases in food production, but it comes at a terrible cost. Cities were choked with smoke and filth, tenement houses that were just absolutely cramped. People tell stories about Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, just at the turn of century, just a little over 100 years ago, women would put on shawls and put on parasols, not to shield themselves from the sun or the weather, but to keep the constant soot off of them, because it would just descend constantly from the steel mills and the coke furnaces. It was just terrible. And so, you know, things like smokestacks began to blight the landscape. And that's even before we talk about what the conditions were like inside. A lot of the early industrial mills were textile mills. This required lots of threads. And of course, women and children had very nice small hands that could do this, and the conditions were absolutely brutal. This ultimately led to the progressive movement and laws against child labor by the end of the 19th century. But it really was a time where people were seeing their beautiful landscape begin to get paved over. So the origins of the modern environmental movement and people loving nature really has its origins there. And you can actually see it in the poetry at the time. William Blake, the great romantic poet, wrote the songs for the lyrics for the song that would eventually become Jerusalem, the famous English hymn. And it tells the story of this legend that Jesus Christ visited England as a young boy. I know, crazy story, but it's an old legend. And the line in there says, "And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here among those dark satanic mills?" So dark satanic mills has become a term of art that now exists in English literature. Because William Blake and everyone in the early 19th century were seeing the transformation of their countryside all around them. We're still seeing it. Urbanization and industrialization are continuing. And I'm happy to say that if you go to Pittsburgh today, you don't have to wear shawls and parasols to keep the soot from you. But there are the rivers that used to just be filled with oil and used to catch fire. Those are a lot cleaner. We've gotten a lot better in a lot of ways, but we obviously still have a lot of other things that we need to work on. But those ideas, those issues came of that age for a very big reason, because the people were seeing the countryside disappear. And so there is a movement towards landscape for that reason. Amongst artists and poets, there's this growing sense that we're losing nature, so we need to preserve it, we need to commemorate it. And so you see artists such as John Constable emerge. John Constable, a British artist, would make these scenes that, again, elevate nature, that turn the whole canvas over to the glorification of nature. In the romantic vein, I love his brushwork because at times it seems very tight, But when you look very closely, you realize it's very loose. He loved cloudscapes, and there's nothing in the world more abstract than clouds. They're just water vapor that move at the wind, and so you can see that he's really loosely brushing in the strokes of light and dark here. He's also elevating a sense of normal everyday life, that he was elevating the moral virtues of simple country life. There's always been this kind of separation between rural and urban populations. What's interesting is that it switches political parties. In the 19th century, it was the conservatives who were saying, oh, wait, we got to stop building these industrial mills and paving over landscape. We've got to start elevating, rural values in landscape and country life. And it was the progressives who were like, no, urbanization and industrialization will lead us to greater prosperity. And then in the 20th century, it kind of flipped. And now you have progressives saying, no, wait, we got to back off this industrialization. And the conservatives are like, oh, no, this is fine. So you see these kind of political flips all the time. It's interesting. It's not just one party versus the other. But you can see that in his art. You can see how it extols those virtues. Here's another one. I love this. Trying to catch a rainbow, something as ephemeral as a rainbow, and also the rays of light as it comes through the sun, the sense of rain and a storm, oftentimes with individuals in wagons with horses, emphasizing more primitive ways. Beautiful stuff, incredible stuff, but elevating the landscape and elevating man's sense of the landscape. In John Constable's works, the figures are always small relative to the landscape. They're always kind of put in a place that they're diminished relative to the landscape. So there's this moral aspect to it that, hey, we are part of the world. We're not dominant over the world. We need to recognize that. And of course, this has its own effect in America. America was a country with lots of open territory in the 19th century. That was the whole, frontier philosophy, that we had this manifest destiny to take it all and to civilize it. But even then, there were people worried about, what did that mean? And so you have the establishment of the Hudson River School, which was not a formal school by any means. It was just a collection of artists, all of them who were active in the Hudson River Valley area of New York, but they were active all over the United States, who wanted to use landscape as a way of demonstrating moral character. So you have Thomas Cole. Thomas Cole will paint the American landscape, in this case, giving a sense of how it is ennobling. And the American landscape becomes a kind of moral thing in and of itself. I love this. We have the moving in of the thunderstorm. We have the light. We have the dark. We have the oxbow. We do have subtle little, kind of parasol. There's the artist Kit. You can see the artist there. You can see how diminutive he is relative to the landscape. This is something we'll see in a lot of Thomas Cole's work, that the figure is often diminutive compared to the landscape, emphasizing that the land is always there, but mankind comes and goes. Here's one of my favorite pieces by him. This is The Architect's Dream. And so here we have the architect pointing to his plans, resting on a gigantic column. And all over here, all the great works of architecture, the Egyptian temples, the Roman and Greek temples. You can see the pyramids there and the background. And it's separated by a gulf, a kind of river. And over here, at a much smaller scale, embedded in trees and nature, is a humble little parish Gothic church. Not a grand cathedral, but a humble little parish church. So there's a moralization going on here, that all the great architecture of the past is past. But America is going to have a new architecture, a Christian architecture, an architecture that is more at peace with the land around it. This is a theme he would explore many times. One of my favorite series that he ever did is this, The Course of Empire. Now, in all of these paintings, you have the same mountain in the background. You have a bay, and you have this very recognizable cliff face, which may have been borrowed from a mountain that he was fond of painting in New England. But either way, this mountain stays the same, but the culture and everyone around it changes. And what he's trying to show is the development of mankind, and also this concept of hubris, of how mankind develops, but he also falls to his own decadence and to his own pride. The whole series of paintings starts off with this painting, which is called The Savage State. And so, it's a little bit racist, but here we have a group of teepees. Teepees were, of course, known by as residences of Native Americans. We have this figure here with bow, who is a kind of Europeanized male, but we also have other figures, individuals who are hunting the deer. You can see the deer even has an arrow in its back. He's just released it. So this was the state of man before the arrival of civilization. It was, you can see that nature is intimidating, it's scary, there are thunderstorms and clouds, it's craggy rocks. It's really kind of not a pleasant place. And then the next stage is the pastoral or Arcadian state. And you'll notice here, the people are farmers. You can see that they're drawing in the dirt. They're actually beginning the sources of human knowledge. You can see that they're dressed in clothes, not animal skins. They have time to dance and to party. There is a temple up here which is loosely based on Stonehenge. There is our mountain with its rock up on the corner again. There is the bay. You can see settlements. People are hard at work, plowing fields and raising sheep. They're building ships. This is kind of the high point of human civilization. Even though we don't have these big fancy buildings, we're still religious, we still have a sense of ourselves, we have everything that we need, we live in harmony with nature. And notice that nature is very welcoming. So unlike the savage state where we're kind of at the mercies of nature, nature here is welcoming. Nature provides everything that we need. Then we get to the next scene, which is the consummation of empire. And here you still have that very obvious cliff face in the background, but that's it. Notice here that nature is completely subsumed. We have a little gesture of a few mountains. Other than that, everything is covered with all of these buildings. And the buildings are decadent to the extreme. And notice they're also classical buildings, from Greek and Roman civilizations. We have garlands, we have parades. This is obviously some kind of imperial procession, fancy ships, all kinds of trade. But it's very clearly decadent. It's very clearly too far. They have taken the gifts of nature and abused them. And they are ripe for destruction, which is the very next scene. So in the very next scene, we see war and strife has torn the whole country apart. Their great monuments are now headless and broken. And the whole city is in ruin, in flame and fire. But notice that the mountain is still there. It hasn't changed. And then we finally get to the last scene, which is desolation, which is the return of our cities to nature. That, again, and you can see there's actually kind of a theme of time as well, that the savage state is in the morning. Then as we get to kind of later in the morning, we have the Arcadian or the pastoral state. The consummation of empire is high noon. Then as we get into afternoon and the evening, we have the destruction. And then, of course, now we have the moon. We're passing into the night. And here, all that is left is ruins. And you can see by the vegetation that all of this is being consumed by nature. So it's a kind of a romantic ideal, but it's this view that everything will ultimately return to nature anyway, so don't get too arrogant. It's, again, a very fascinating view, a fascinating idea, a warning against man and the excesses of civilization. You never would have gotten that in the neoclassical time period. In the neoclassical time period, they would have been, yeah, civilization, science, let's go. This is progress. And this is almost anti-progress. It's saying, no, we got to put the brakes on this. You can see this in the works of other members of the Hudson River School. I don't have enough time to go through this, but Frederick Edwin Church, who also painted a lot of scenes from his travels all over the tropics as well. Again, giving most of the scene over to this abstract sky and showing this incredibly deep horizon, diminishing the scale of man relative to nature. This elevation of nature, I think, is probably seen the best in Bierstadt's works. Bierstadt would paint scenes from the American West. What's interesting is that he would often increase the scale of his mountains. So these mountains are actually bigger than the Sierra Nevada mountains really are. So again, it's this romanticization of nature, elevating nature. Notice that the animals lead us in, but the foreground is diminished. It's almost all background, meant to show us our role in nature. And again, romanticizing the American landscape. There was this kind of sense that, America didn't have any deep history. It does, actually. I teach non-Western art. Boy, does America have deep history. It's just that it all got wiped out in the pandemics by the conquistadors and the colonial period. But save that for my non-Western class. But there was this sense that America didn't have cathedrals and buildings and history like Europe did. But what it did have was this primordial nature, that we didn't need cathedrals because we had the Grand Canyon, the Rocky Mountains. We had all these incredible vistas. And I have to say, living in Utah, that certainly still resonates today. Utah is an absolutely phenomenally beautiful state. I've lived in Pennsylvania. It's beautiful, but it just doesn't have the grand vistas and scale that Utah does. If I had to be a farmer, I'd choose Pennsylvania. If I just had to live somewhere, I'd choose Utah. It's gorgeous vistas and arches and Capitol Reef and Rainbow Bridge and Lake Powell and the Uintas. It's just gorgeous country. There's no prettier country in the world. And that elevation of nature is definitely there. Now, there are some romantic painters who are doing something a little bit more psychological, however. Romantic landscape painters are certainly not limited to America. America had this vast open west, which, lent itself naturally to those kind of scale paintings. But we also see a lot of romantic landscape painters in Europe. And one of the most prominent is Caspar David Friedrich. Caspar David Friedrich being a German painter. And he painted also this sense of awe at nature. But what makes his work different is that he would often paint individuals into the scene at a larger scale. But these individuals function to draw us into the scene. This is one of his most famous paintings, Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog. And here is this hiker. And that's a kind of interesting thing, is that people going out and hiking in nature and enjoying being in nature for the sake of nature, that again is something we take as second nature. We're just like, yeah, of course, you're going to enjoy nature. But that was not the case in the 19th century. All of these hiking clubs, all of these, clubs that emphasized going out and camping and being out in the air and roughing it, that was something that emerged out of the 19th century. Again, this sense that we were losing our connection to nature because of the rapid industrialization, and so we needed to get back to it. Again, the themes are the insignificance of man against nature. We don't see this man, we don't see his face, we only see his back, but that draws us into the scene and forces us to contemplate what he is looking at. Here we see a landscape that's just fog with a few mountains and rocks. Beyond it, it shows the uncertainty, the danger of nature, but also the romance of nature. We'll see the same kind of theme in a lot of Caspar David Friedrich's work. This is the Sea of Ice. This, of course, 19th century was a time for great exploration. One of the great explorations was looking for the Northwest Passage. Is there any way to get through the North Sea to the Pacific Ocean from the North Atlantic? And a lot of ships perished. And so here you see a ship crushed underneath the ice all broken up with logs and timbers and masts being, chewed up. It's beautiful, but it's also scary. There's a sense of menace, even more menace than in some of Thomas Cole's work. Thomas Cole's work definitely has this moralizing message about our relationship to nature, but Caspar David Friedrich really sums up the horror and peril of nature, because nature's dang scary. I mean, I've heard of Australia. Everything there is trying to kill you. I've heard of the outdoors. Yeah, lots of scary things happen in nature. And we can take nature for granted because we live in a world where, you know, gosh, it happened just this week. Somebody up the Provo Canyon up near Bridal Hill Falls got stuck and had to be rescued. And, you know, we have helicopters and rescue teams that can go rescue people when nature gets a little too real. But that didn't exist back then. So there is this duality to nature. Nature is beautiful. It's inspiring. It, of course, gives us all the fruits of nature that we use to feed ourselves, build our ships, and everything else. Everything comes from nature. But at the same time, nature will straight up stone cold kill you if you're not paying attention. And so you see this duality of the world. I love this. Here is, again, nature in the distance, and we have a ruined abbey representing the construction of men. And of course, you have a graveyard, so there's this emblem of death. You have these individuals approaching the graveyard. The abbey has collapsed, but these craggy oaks are still there. Nature still survives. The other thing that's so incredible about Friedrich's work is how absolutely abstract they can be. This just becomes a field, a gradient field, and we almost lose the sense of the figuration or the representation of trees and abbeys and everything else. It actually becomes more about the color and tonality. The strongest example of that is Monk by the Sea. So here we have a monk standing on a seashore, but there's almost nothing to hold on to. There's nothing to hang your hat on. The horizon between the sea and the sky almost completely disappears. The sea is nondescript and almost formless, and the entire thing is given over to this very gauzy representation of clouds with only a few highlights to let you know what you're looking at. And the figure is so insignificant. So very similar to that wanderer above the sea of fog, but there we're at least given a person contemplating his role between nature. Here it just sums up his insignificance, and it really just becomes an abstract painting. In fact, you could crop any 10 inches out of this, and it would work as an abstract painting. It shows how much landscape painting was moving us towards the sense of surface, to the sense of abstraction. But no one does that better than James Mallard William Turner. James Mallard William Turner was an interesting character as a British artist who was a child prodigy, first exhibited at age 14, incredible. And he was championed by critic John Ruskin. John Ruskin was one of the most famous critics of the 19th century. We'll come back to him. He loved some painters and hated others. We'll talk about his court trial with Whistler in a future lecture. But he was one of the champions of Turner. Turner had this ability to really tackle difficult lighting subjects. He would go out and paint directly from life. And painting in the dark is hard, people. It's hard even now if you could shine a light on your canvas or shine a flashlight at your landscape to take a look at it. Imagine trying to paint moonlight on a canvas in the dark. It's just impossible. Everything is dark. And yet here he was at a very early age trying to pull it off. What's fascinating is that as he goes on, as he ages, he becomes even more and more experimental until a series of paintings that he paints in the 1840s really are just exceptional for the age. This is Rain, Steam, and Speed, the Great Western Railway, and here is the train, but almost everything is lost. You have a bridge down here, a boat here, but almost everything is lost in the fog and the motion of the rain and the steam. His paintings have lots of heavy paint. We call it impasto. You can see how it builds up on the canvas. Some of these, it's hard to even imagine that they're actually representational paintings. Here can you see the steamship? There's its kind of flag. There's its smokestack. Here's the side wheel, the paddle wheel. But other than that, this just rages and it becomes this abstract swirling force of nature. Beautiful stuff. And so John Ruskin was instrumental in saying, a lot of people criticize this as being unfinished or just a mess, but John Ruskin says, no, this was deliberate and this carried this real passion and energy. And so landscape, because clouds and sea and steam and spray are by their very nature abstract, lead us more into the direction of abstraction and surface. You can see that here in this one. This is the slave ship. Again, a very topical work. The subject here is a slave ship and this rising storm over here. And when you got in a storm, the ship started to take on water, you would lighten the cargo by jettisoning the cargo. That was common practice, you know. Better to save your lives in the ship and lose the cargo. Well, if you're a slave ship, what's the cargo? The cargo is slaves. And so here we see in the water hands reaching out of the surf, legs still with shackles and chains and irons. These are the slaves that have been jettisoned so that the ship can survive the storm. And then you see the seabirds and the scavengers coming to attack them. Really brutal, ugly, contemporary subject matter. But it becomes a thing of beauty in Turner's hands. So, but notice how much of this is given off to abstraction. We only see a little bit of the figures and the horror there. You could be forgiven for not noticing the gruesome details by concentrating on just this incredible use of light and color. The sun is indistinct. It's just a reflection on the water and a bright spot burning through the clouds. I think this one is even more so. Landscape with water. Holy cow. There's almost nothing to hold on to. So we see that, you know, the ideas of modernism, this contemporary subject matter, this activism, this bringing attention to current events, that's a contemporary thing. This emphasis on surface and abstraction, this freeing yourself from the limits of a classical subject matter or having to paint in an academic or classical style, that the roots of all those things that we associate with modernism really do have their origin in the Romantic period. And it's not an accident that if you are a British artist and every year the Tate gives out an award, a major award, to what they consider to be the greatest living contemporary British artist. And that award is known as the Turner Award, and it is named for Turner. And you can see why, because in many cases a lot of people make the argument that he was the first truly modern artist in that regard. So Romanticism is the break. Romanticism is where things start to break. And then we will see rapid progression after this into Realism, Impressionism, and Post-Impressionism. But there's another very important piece of the puzzle we haven't talked about yet, and that's photography. That as Romanticism is happening, a new art form is created, and that is photography. And the impact that it has on the arts and on art in general, and just our understanding of images, is utterly and truly profound. But we'll save that for the next lecture. Thanks so much. Catch you next time.